be sure to check out Rob Plays. There you can hang out with me while we play video games and talk about life stuff. So continuing our discussion on Jean Grey, with the last video establishing her character's publication history as being lackluster, and that she was routinely shown to have been the X-Men's weakest member, constantly requiring the efforts of her teammates in both training simulations and real-world conflicts. After taking over the series with Uncanny X-Men issue number 94, because Claremont looked to the X-Men lineup as a series that could expand the motives and ideologies of its individual members, Jean Grey was used as an experimental platform in an effort to bolster her status within both the X-Men team proper and the Marvel Universe as a whole. To this end, with X-Men issue number 98 going into issue number 101, Claremont orchestrated his reinvention of Jean within the pages of the prelude to the Phoenix Saga. Centering on the introduction of Stephen Lang as an anti-mutant fanatic who had been assigned the Sentinel Project following the defeat of Bolivar Trask, during the climax of the three-part story, a handful of the original X-Men had been kidnapped by Lang and taken to a satellite orbiting the Earth, during which time, Cyclops, Jean, and the remaining members of the team launched a rescue mission. Coming into conflict with both the traditional Sentinels as well as a new model designed to mimic the original X-Men team in both appearance and abilities, where the X-Men themselves were successful in defeating Lang during their journey back to Earth, the group was bombarded with cosmic radiation, incapacitating all the other members and piloting the shuttle back herself. During its re-entry and while succumbing to the lethal effects of radiation, Jean had telepathically reached out to the Phoenix Force, which in turn offered a pact of sorts. As it was explained, Jean was quite literally walking the line between life and death, and that if she had survived and been allowed to return to Earth, she likely would have fallen into a catatonic state due in part to her mind's inability to cope with the pain that she was experiencing, as well as the shock of nearly dying. Offering to bond itself with Jean, the original intention of Claremont was to have her character go forward as a wholly new being with her abilities of telepathy and telekinesis enhanced to cosmic levels. Accepting the entity's offer and arriving back on Earth, after the shuttle had landed, Jean emerged from the water, declaring herself to have been reborn as the Phoenix. Using this as a jumping-off platform, with issue number 101, Claremont began to both expand on the X-Men's place within the Marvel cosmos, as well as introduce a host of new concepts on the cosmic level, but largely confined to the X-Men as a team. With its first piece coming to fruition as the Shiar, where their empire existed as an amalgamation of various races coming together and swearing allegiance to the Imperial Crown, Claremont also established that the Shiar functioned to ensure the safety of the Imcron Crystal, a physical stone operating as the nexus point for all realities of the multiverse. However, with the Shiar ruler Daken losing his sanity and developing a lust for power, his younger sister Lilandra had come to the conclusion that Daken looked to secure the powers of the Imcron Crystal to not only rule the universe, but take over all other realities as well. Making contact with Charles Xavier and the X-Men owing to the fact that the Earth had some of the most powerful beings in the universe, because the Phoenix Force was a protector of life and tied directly to the crystal itself, the Phoenix Saga unfolded and concluded with Jean and the X-Men joining forces with the Shiar, the newly introduced Starjammers led by Cyclops' father, and a host of other beings, all of whom battled the forces of Daken. Culminating in the Imcron Crystal cracking, Claremont added a bit of history to the Marvel Universe, and stating that if the Imcron Crystal were to shatter entirely, the multiverse itself would end, after which the crystal would reform and initiate a recreation of all things. While this bit of storytelling would become a cornerstone of Marvel Comics and remain part of future stories, which would reveal that the Earth 616 universe was actually the seventh incarnation as a result of the previous multiverse's destruction leading into the birth of Galactus, in terms of the main event, the Phoenix Saga proper saw the Imcron Crystal cracked by Daken and healed by the Phoenix, resulting in the multiverse being saved and the X-Men returning to Earth. Using this to beef up the team's individual stories as well as wrap around to the conclusion of the Phoenix epic, with the events between the conclusion of the Phoenix Saga and Uncanny X-Men issue number 108 and the beginning of the Dark Phoenix Saga and Uncanny X-Men issue number 192 saw Cyclops spending time with his father and a love triangle forming between Jean, Scott, and Wolverine, Claremont began to set the stage for his finale by introducing the international clandestine organization called the Hellfire Club. Originally led by Sebastian Shaw and composed of Emma Frost, Donald Pierce, Harry Leland, and tentative initiate Jason Wingard, the Hellfire Club operated behind the scenes, manipulating the financial and political sector to both remain hidden and ensure the success of their plans to dominate the world. Taking notice of Jean Grey due to Emma Frost's Omega-level telepathic powers and viewing Jean as a potential member who could be used to further their schemes, Jason Wingard was tasked with manipulating her five senses, stealing Jean away from the X-Men, and inducting her into their ranks as proof of his capabilities in being an asset. However, with the conclusion of the Phoenix Saga seeing Jean give herself fully to the entity, as well as Phoenix itself having never experienced the full range of human emotions, the manipulations of Jason Wyngarde exposed the Phoenix Force to a multitude of concepts, including lust, rage, envy, and revenge. Becoming enthralled and overwhelmed, the goal of Chris Claremont came to its fruition in that where the Phoenix Saga represented rebirth, the Dark Phoenix Saga intended to represent corruption and fall from grace. Losing all sense of sanity and stepping into the role of a villain, after overpowering the mind of Jason Wyngarde and sending him into a catatonic state, Jean took to the universe, consuming a sun and destroying its solar system, killing an entire culture in the process. Drawing the attention of the Shiar who viewed the rogue entity as a threat to the universe itself, the Dark Phoenix Saga reached its climax when the X-Men suppressed the power of the Phoenix Force and invoked the Shiar's tradition of trial by combat, facing off against the Imperial Guard. With the X-Men being overwhelmed entirely and the Phoenix Force breaking loose, Colossus was able to launch an attack, assaulting Jean and restoring her sanity temporarily, during which time she informed Cyclops that the only way to spare his life and the lives of the team was to sacrifice herself. Activating a Kree weapon left behind after their experiments on the Inhumans, Jean was atomized completely and erased from existence. That said, where Claremont had intended for the Dark Phoenix Saga to conclude with Jean being depowered, leaving the X-Men and forming a family with Cyclops, because the Comics Code was still a major part of the industry, albeit with more and more publishers ignoring the rules, the idea of punishment for evil deeds was still a major concept which could not be ignored. This, combined with the strict editorial policies of Jim Shooter as editor-in-chief, resulted in the death of Jean and Cyclops abandoning the team. Intending to carry out his ending as he envisioned, Chris Claremont introduced Madeline Pryor, a woman who was for all intents and purposes identical to Jean in terms of memories and physical appearance. Using the emotional state of Scott Summers as a means to bring the two together and bear a child who would go on to become Cable, the other half of this equation came in the form of both fan feedback and continued editorial mandates from Shooter. Covered in a 2012 article by the Austin Chronicle titled Chris Claremont, Dead Should Mean Dead, because the Phoenix and Dark Phoenix sagas were so well received, these stories combined with the overall works of Claremont had catapulted the X-Men team to the front of Marvel's lineup, outselling all other titles by a margin of 3-1. Looking to capitalize on fan demand by launching a new series titled X Factor under the writing of Louise Simonson, Jim Shooter looked to see Jean Grey return to the landscape while also ensuring the continuity of her character. Considered to be one of the most controversial retcons in the history of comics, Claremont's hand was essentially forced, requiring him to establish that after having reached out to the Phoenix Force while piloting the shuttle back to Earth, Jean's physical body was placed in stasis at the bottom of Jamaica Bay, while the Phoenix took on her form and acted in her stead. As a result, the events of the Phoenix and Dark Phoenix sagas had their value stripped away, in that Jean herself had not risen to prominence and fallen from grace, and instead, the events themselves were entirely in the hand of the Phoenix Force. To this end, fans had found themselves absolutely livid and feeling betrayed, believing that their journey with Jean Grey was all for nothing. While this didn't directly affect the sales of the X-Men title owing in part to Claremont's writing style and the fact that fans still had a host of other characters who were relatable and enjoyable, this retcon, among other issues, led to a continued dislike of Jim Shooter as Marvel's editor-in-chief. That being said, because the landscape was set for Jean to return in X Factor issue number 1, Madeline Pryor was not written out of the picture so much as she remained in the background. Leading into the events of Cable's timeline and the future of Earth as it was ruled by Apocalypse, while you can learn this information in my video about Cable himself, Jean, Cyclops, Angel, Iceman, and Beast maintained their own X Factor title under the writing of Louise Simonson, routinely crossing over with the X-Men team. During this time, Louise Simonson began to flesh out the backstory of Jean even further, focusing on her sister, the rise in anti-mutant sentiments, the idea of Cyclops producing a son with Madeline, and the introduction of Rachel Summers as a time-displaced daughter of Scott and Jean from the Days of Future Past, all of which was written in a manner that depicted Jean catching up on everything she had missed. With the stories of Louise Simonson receiving critical acclaim for their depth and focus, some of which rivaled the works of Chris Claremont, the continued rise of the X-Men's popularity saw a wholesale reformation of both X Factor and X-Men. Taking place in 1991 with X-Men Volume 2, Issue Number 1, both teams were merged into a singular group but split into two factions, referred to as the Gold and Blue teams. Initially coming under the control of Chris Claremont as writer and Jim Lee as artist, both of whom had vacated their positions within Marvel Comics by issue number 20, this time period saw a paradigm shift to dark and high-octane stories following the success of Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns. Remaining within the pages of Uncanny X-Men under the writing of John Byrne and later by Scott Lobdell, in truth, Jean's time in the post-Claremont era saw her taking a back seat amidst the surge of X-Men universe expansions, including the former New Mutants now operating as X-Force, the introduction of Psylocke, and Marvel Presents Weapon X, detailing the story of Wolverine. While events like the Onslaught Saga and Jean learning of Charles' hidden love affair for her, as well as the marriage of Scott and Jean in 1994's Uncanny X-Men issue number 308, stand out as important parts of her character, on the whole, the damage of the Phoenix and Dark Phoenix sagas continued to linger, and that while she wasn't reviled by fans, the magic had essentially been lost. As a result, Jean found herself falling rank and file with the rest of the team going into June of 2001 with the launch of New X-Men. Orchestrated by editor-in-chief Joe Quesada and written by Grant Morrison in an effort to beef up the failing title following the near collapse of the comic book industry in the late 1990s, the style of Morrison took a more liberal approach, focusing on the team assuming the roles of teachers to a new generation of mutants at the Xavier Institute, while dealing with their own personal issues, relationships, and dealing with the newly emerging pro- and anti-mutant political sentiments. At the same time, the series also saw the return of Jean's telekinesis, a re-emergence of her ability to tap into the powers of the Phoenix Force, her assumption of the duties as headmistress of the Xavier Institute, and the failing of her marriage to Cyclops following a psychic affair with Emma Frost. Remaining on as writer for 41 issues, during his 4-year run, Morrison blended the writing style of Claremont with his own, focusing on the individual members but also casting aside virtually all classic villains, and instead introducing new individuals like Cassandra Nova alongside her massacre of 16 million mutants on the island of Genosha. Considered one of the best runs, if not a bit polarizing to fans of more traditional stories, with the exception of Jean's reaction to Scott's psychic affair with Emma Frost and her death at the hands of Magneto masquerading as Zorn, on the whole, she remained a backseat character, fighting various villains and instructing a new age of mutants with all manner of appearances. While Morrison's time concluded with the story Here Comes Tomorrow depicting an alternate reality where Cyclops chose not to run the Xavier Institute alongside Emma following the death of Jean, the story of Morrison, like nearly all of his writings, was left to the interpretation of the reader, much to the chagrin of existing fans who sought closure to his time on the title. Revisiting these concepts during his time as writer of New X-Men following Morrison's departure, writer Chuck Austen established Jean as having stepped into the role of the White Phoenix of the Crown, existing in an ambiguous manner described as performing surgery on the universe, using her powers to reach back in time and influence Scott into running the school alongside Emma and preventing the Here Comes Tomorrow timeline. Having said that, while Morrison's run did contain a finite conclusion, the issue faced by fans was that there had been a 150-year gap between the death of Jean at the hands of Zorn and her re-emergence as the White Phoenix of the Crown during the events of Here Comes Tomorrow. As a result, readers were largely left scratching their heads owing to the fact that Chuck Austen's work treated the concept as if it had already existed, as well as feeling a little irritated at the idea that Jean had not received a proper send-off. Looking to fill the holes left by the Morrison-Austen confusion as well as the mess that came with the X-Men Reloaded initiative, which focused on relaunching and rebranding the X-Men related titles, in 2005 under the writing of Greg Pak, Phoenix Endsong returned to the concept of Jean's death and a relation to the White Phoenix of the Crown. Centering on the Shiar Empire resurrecting the Phoenix, which in turn resurrected Jean Grey, in an effort to prevent the Phoenix Force from seizing control of her and leading to a second incarnation of the Dark Phoenix, Jean had sought to have Wolverine kill her and confine her body in ice, both of which proved to be unsuccessful. Depicting the Phoenix as a self-aware cosmic entity which looked to return to its darker nature and continue experiencing human emotions, after merging with Jean who succeeded in taking control of the Phoenix, the story ended with the now iconic scene of Jean offering her goodbyes to Scott, providing one of only a handful of instances whereby Marvel has killed a character without bringing them back. With that being said, we're going to bring this video to an end, and the next discussion we have about Jean Grey will be all new, all different Jean, and will actually tie into the events of Civil War and what it means with Jean Grey appearing in the story. But with that being said, I will catch you guys later. Peace.